obviously, obviously a very important figure for us. And the Torah gives us approximately about two portions where Abraham and his life is discussed. The first one is this one, Lech Lecha. Even though in the end of last week's parsha, there were a few verses about Abraham being born and marrying, but it was just very brief. And in this parsha, Abraham is introduced, and it's interesting to think about, as we've done in the last few Sundays, what stories the Torah chooses to tell about Abraham, what stories the Torah chooses to omit and leave it for the Medrash. In other words, what part of Abraham's life do we tell, do we highlight, and what can we learn from all of this? So the journey begins. We will do as our custom is and read the parsha in a nutshell. So we'll share that on the screen so we get the big picture of the topics discussed. So again, Lech Lecha in a nutshell. Lech Lecha is the name of the parsha. Very famous words, Lech Lecha. Literally, it means go to you. But that's another whole discussion of what does that mean, Lech Lecha. But in any case, the nutshell reads, God speaks to Abraham, commanding him, go forth, go from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. There, God says, he will be made into a great nation. Abraham and his wife Sarai, accompanied by his nephew Lot, journey to the land of Canaan, where Abraham builds an altar and continues to spread the message of a one God. A famine forces the first Jew to depart for Egypt, where beautiful Sarai is taken to Pharaoh's palace. Abraham escapes death because they present themselves as brother and sister. A plague prevents the Egyptian king from touching her and convinces him to return her to Abraham and to compensate the brother revealed as husband with gold, silver, and cattle. Back in the land of Canaan, Lot separates from Abraham and settles in the evil city of Sodom, where he falls captive when the mighty armies of Kedar-Laomer and his three allies conquer the 5 cities of the Sodom Valley. Abraham sets out with a small band to rescue his nephew, defeats the 4 kings, and is blessed by Melchizedek, the king of Salem. We assume it's Jerusalem, so the bracket writes Jerusalem. God seals the covenant between the parts with Abraham, in which the exile and persecution, galut, of the people of Israel is foretold. And the Holy Land is bequeathed to them as their eternal heritage. Still childless 10 years after their arrival in the land, Sarai tells Abraham to marry her maidservant Hagar. Hagar conceives, becomes insolent toward her mistress, and then flees when Sarai treats her harshly. An angel convinces her to return and tells her that her son will father a populous nation. Ishmael is born, and Abraham is born in Abraham's 86th year. 13 years later, God changes Abraham's name to Abraham, adding the Hey, the H sound, father of multitudes, and Sarai to Sarah, princess. Really, princess is not the right word. Sarah is mistress, in other words, the minister, and promises that his son will be born to them. From this child, whom they should call Isaac, will stem the great nation with which God will establish a special bond. Abraham is commanded to circumcise himself and his descendants as a sign of the covenant between me and you. Abraham immediately complies, circumcising himself and all the males of his household. And that's the conclusion of the first portion that discusses Abraham. Next week, we pick up 3 days after the circumcision, and the narrative of Abraham continues. So that, in a nutshell, at least according to Chabad.org, is the story in short. And now we want to start thinking about delving in a little bit. Ken, are you trying to say something? Because you're muted. I don't know if you were trying to ask a question, but either way, no. Okay, let's begin the journey. Okay, so we spoke about this. I just want to mention just very briefly, because we spent a lot of time on this last couple of weeks on Sundays. Where does the story of Abraham begin? And there is really different biographies of Abraham. Everybody says something else, and everybody highlights something else. In other words, if you look at this narrative in the Torah starts when Abraham is 75 years old. What happened till he was 75 years old? So there's various narratives. If you read the Medrash paints Abraham as somebody who discovers God on his own from a very young age, and the Medrash and to the extent he's so convinced in his in the truth of his new beliefs, and he just realizes that everybody around him is mistaken in their worship of idols and their pagan ways, that that you must have heard the Medrash where Abraham breaks all the idols in his father's shop, and he in general he smashes idols literally and figuratively, in the sense that he has the courage to go up against the people of his society and preach and to explain to them that they're wrong. So that's a very powerful narrative that the Medrash tells us. Maimonides tells us that doesn't emphasize so much that aspect, even though he mentions it as well. It's in the Medrash. Maimonides' picture of Abraham is somebody who starts thinking about God at 3 years old, but he doesn't really reach a conclusion until he's 40. He says when he's 40, the Maimonides says, when Abraham is 40, he recognizes God. In other words, how does he recognize God also? It comes from deep contemplation and understanding of the sciences, and realizing that the physical world also leads you to the understanding that there's metaphysical, there's something greater than the physical. And it's more of a philosophical journey that leads Abraham to God. And those are two beautiful narratives, and they're both important. And the commentators putting forth this narrative is really, they're really making a statement about what it is to be Jewish. What do you need to be Jewish? So the Medrash seems to highlight the foundation of being Jewish is the ability to smash idols. It's the ability to stand up and be different and say that we disagree with what everyone else is doing. Some people, that's certainly an ingredient that we needed to be able to survive. By the way, it comes from this week's parsha. This week's parsha is the first time when Abraham is called Abraham HaIvri, Abraham the Hebrew. And what does Hebrew mean? So we all speak Hebrew, we know Hebrew, we want to know Hebrew, but what does the word Hebrew mean? So Hebrew literally means from the Aver, from the other side of the river. And the Medrash makes the point that we refer to Abraham as Abraham from the other side of the river, even though, as we will see, Abraham was not the only one in Israel from the other side of the river. It's because it means what they were saying is this guy's the other. This person, not only did he migrate here, but he's still an outsider because his perspective, his philosophy is different than everybody else. The way the sages put it, the whole world is on one side of the river and Abraham is another side of the river. So, but the Medrash's point is, to be Jewish, you have to be able to have that within you to be able to stand up and say, I can be different. Now, I'm not saying you need to do this today in America 2021. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But historically, we had to have that gene. We had to have that ability to not be afraid to smash idols and say everybody else is wrong and we're right. You needed that sort of rebellion gene to be able to continue the legacy of Abraham. That's one perspective. Other people look at Abraham like Maimonides, and they say, well, who's Maimonides? Who's Abraham? Abraham Abraham represents the philosophical journey to God. He studied, he meditated, he went to university, he studied all the sciences. When he was 40, he realized, after he got all the master's degrees and all the PhDs, he realized that in addition to everything science is telling him, there's something more. There's also something that creates all of the natural world. So that's the image of Abraham, the philosopher, the scholar. And that's also important to Jewish life. The idea that we study and we contemplate, and that's what leads us to Hashem. So all this is all true and right, and we need all of them. But as we mentioned in the past, the Torah itself doesn't tell you this. It's not what you need. Why? Because the Torah is telling us, this is in the Medrash, but what is the Torah telling us? Torah is telling us, what's the foundation of being Jewish? Yes, we have to have also the ability to be a Hebrew, to be separate, to be different, even to rebel against the rest of the world, and even to be able to have the courage to say, you may be wrong. Just because you're in the majority, it doesn't mean you're right. And we also have to have the ability to be able to discover God through our own inquiry. Wonderful. It's a wonderful Jewish trait to keep asking and keep studying and keep learning. All wonderful. But that's not what the Torah itself writes in the narrative, because the Torah itself, what is the Torah going to tell you? The Torah tells you, what's the opening story? Lech lecha, you go, you travel. But in the broader sense, the ability to follow God's commandments. And from our perspective, that's what it means to be Jewish. It's like the Jewish people when they got the Torah, they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do what God says. We have that commitment to God, and then we will do, and then we will hear, then we will listen, then we will study. Yes, we want to study. Yes, we want to understand, but that's not the foundation. The foundation of the Jew is Abraham heeding God's call, and that's the foundation of our relationship with God. And we can elaborate upon this philosophically, why this is so important. And I'm just going to give briefly. The brief interpretation is as follows: if God is infinite and we're finite, so in a sense, nothing we can do on our own could create that bridge between the finite and the infinite. So I say, okay, I'm going to go to study about the greatness of Hashem, and I'm going to do what Maimonides did and what Abraham did. We are going to discover God based on the power of our intellect, of our inquiry. We're going to prove that this extremely complex universe must have a designer. Okay, we figure that out. But God is still infinite. So what part of God do we understand? What part of God do we relate to? That's the part of God that could be understood. But God is infinite. So we can't really have a relationship with the infinity. So in some sense, what I'm trying to say is anything that we would do would not create that bond. And the bond with God can only be created on his terms. When God says, here's a mitzvah, and in Hebrew, mitzvah comes from the word togetherness, tzavta, be together. Every mitzvah, every commandment is not God needs something to be done, so he says, do me a favor, please take out the garbage. No, every mitzvah is a chance to bond. It's a chance to connect, right? So what God is telling us, if you want to connect to God, you follow the commandment, and that is the bridge that bridges the finite and the infinite. And that's the foundation of being Jewish, and that's why Abraham's story, even though to be Jewish has many details, and therefore open up the Medrash, you get all sorts of very important stories about the life of Abraham, all true and all important and all critical for not only for Abraham but also for Abraham's descendants. But the question is, what is the essential point? What is the essence of the relationship between God and the Jewish people? And that is the ability of the Jewish people to heed the call of God. To Abraham, it was Lech Lecha, go to yourself. But for us, we have many commandments. Many commandments just means many opportunities to connect. So that's introduction. That's the story in short. I'm going to skip around a little bit, not discuss the stories that we discussed the last few Sundays because you already know this. But I want to go to a figure named Lot. Lot is a person who was Abraham's nephew. Lot's father died. And you read the narrative, you read the story, you see that Lot decided to go with Abraham. Wonderful thing. Abraham says, I'm going to Israel, I'm taking all the people, I'm going to Canaan, then it was Canaan. I'm going to Canaan, I'm taking my possessions, I'm taking the people I influenced. And Lot says, you know what, I'm coming along. And it's wonderful. And Lot keeps popping up in the next two portions of Abraham. It's almost like if you're going to write a story, you have a supporting actor, or you have a sidekick. He keeps coming up. It's almost like the contrast. Something about Lot is always there, and keeps appearing. And later on, we know that Lot gives birth to two nations. That's next week's parsha, and they're also the neighbors of the Jewish people. So Lot is an important figure. I mean, it doesn't seem so important. It doesn't seem like it's moving the plot ahead so powerfully. But for us, I think it's important in the sense that if you really want to understand what does it mean that Abraham is journeying to Israel, you have to look at Lot takes the same journey, but he doesn't end up in the same place. So Lot helps us highlight and understand what Abraham is going through by contrasting that with the process that Lot is going through. So what I want to do is I want to open up the verses, and I want to share just a few verses about Lot and see what that means for us and what that tells us about Abraham, and then of course what it tells us about ourselves. But in short, even before we open the verses, Lot comes with Abraham to Israel, heeding God's call, Lech Lecha, go to yourself. Lot comes with Abraham to Egypt when the famine breaks out. Lot returns from Egypt with Abraham when they come back. And here, the Torah tells us that there is a dispute. There's a dispute that breaks out between the shepherds of Lot and the shepherds of Abraham. Okay, so I'm going to share this screen, and we'll have the opportunity to see the verses for ourselves, and then we'll see if we can make learn anything out of these stories. Okay, here we go. Verse 5. And also Lot, who went with Abraham, had flocks and cattle and tents, and the land did not bear them to dwell together, for their possessions were many, and they could not dwell together. They couldn't live together. Two people in the same land, impossible. Too much possessions. Verse 7. And there was a quarrel between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle and between the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites were then dwelling in the land, which basically tells us, I'm going off track here for a moment, the commentaries say, what are they fighting about? They're fighting about a moral question. Abraham's herdsmen would not let the sheep graze in fields that belonged to other people. Lot was not so careful about theft, and therefore he allowed his herdsmen to graze the sheep in other people's fields. And when Abraham's people told Lot's people, you can't do this, it's theft, they responded, no, the entire land has been promised to Abraham earlier already. So it's Abraham's land. If it's Abraham's land, then it should be given to Abraham. Then Lot is at that point he was his heir. Abraham had no children. I'm Lot, and the entire land belongs to me. That's why in verse 7, Rashi says that the verse inserts right away, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites were then dwelling in the land, meaning, yes, it's destined to be given to Abraham, but it has not yet been given to Abraham, and therefore it did not belong to Lot, and therefore what Lot was doing was theft. In any case, what does Abraham say? Abraham says, look, we're relatives. Why are we fighting? Let's separate. And if we separate, we'll still be friends, right? There's nothing like having a very big family that live far away in a different city. No, I'm kidding. That was a joke. The bottom line is, Abraham says, let's separate. And then we'll be brothers. Verse 8, and Abraham said to Lot, please let there be no quarrel between me and between you, and between my herdsmen and between your herdsmen. We are kinsmen. In Hebrew, anashim achim anachnu. We are brothers. Is not all the land before you? Please part from me. If you go left, I will go right, and if you go right, I will go left. Wonderful. What could be even better than that? Okay. What happens? And Lot raises his eyes, and he saw the entire plain of the Jordan, that it was entirely watered, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you come to Zoar. In other words, if you ever went to the Dead Sea, you know that the approach to the Dead Sea, the Kikar Hayarden, the valley of the Jordan, right now is all desert, because the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. But back then, that entire place wasn't desert; it was watered. There was plenty of water there. Why was there plenty of water there? Because it's next to the river. It's next to the Jordan. And this is before. And if you want to highlight in biblical Israel, if you want to highlight how beautiful the land was, you say it was like Egypt. What do we know about Egypt? Egypt has the Nile, and Egypt, therefore, is not subject to drought, because if it doesn't rain, it doesn't rain in Egypt, but they have the Nile. So the equivalent, in other words, the part of Israel that was similar to Egypt was the Valley of Sodom. Now, you know already enough about the Bible to know that if you're saying something is like Egypt, obviously, the Bible is a little bit critical, because we're not in love with Egypt, we're not in love with their morality. But let's continue. So what does Lot say? And Lot chose for himself the entire plain of the Jordan. And Lot traveled from the east, and they parted from one another. Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan. And Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and he pitched his tent until Sodom. And the people of Sodom were very evil and sinful against the Lord. In other words, don't think that Lot didn't know that, but Lot goes there anyway. And then again, once they part, and the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had parted from him, please raise your eyes and see from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for the land that you see, I will give to you and to your seed to eternity. And I will make your seed like the dust of the earth, so that if the man will be able to count the dust of the earth, so will your seed be counted, etc. It keeps giving him blessings. Okay, well, now, by the way, we're not going to forget about Lot in a few minutes. And then when we turn to the next reading, there's an invasion, there's a regional war. 4 kings come and attack the 5 kings. Lot is taken captive. Abraham comes and fights for the wicked people of Sodom and releases his nephew, but that's all for later. Right now, what do we know? We know Abraham says, let's part. Okay, let's think about this for a second. What is this telling us about Abraham's journey to Israel? What does this tell us about Lot? Even though he comes along with Abraham, nevertheless, he parts from Abraham, and the place where he chooses is telling. And that tells us what the nature of Lot is, what the nature of Abraham is, what the nature of the land of Israel is, and what maybe perhaps also what's the nature of being a Jew living in Israel. In other words, what state of mind are we in when we follow God's voice and move to Israel, either literally but also figuratively. So the one interesting place to look at is where does Abraham, what does Abraham tell Lot? So Abraham tells Lot as follows. He says, look, the entire land is before you. If you go left, I will go right. If you go right, I will go left. In other words, I'm going to be, he doesn't say north or south. That represents we're distancing. When you say right and left are relate to each other. The right of what? The left of what? So Abraham is saying, I'm not divorcing you. You're still my nephew. I will still be there for you if you need help. And that's exactly what happens in this parsha. But he says, if you go right, I'll go left, meaning I want to separate, but I still want to have that relationship. Okay? Right and left of what? So if you look at the commentators, and you look especially at the Targum of Onkelos, which is the first Aramaic translation of the Torah, I don't know if it's the first, but probably the most prominent Aramaic translation of the Torah. He says something interesting. He says, if you go north, I will go south. If you go south, I will go north. Now that's very interesting because right or left, I have no idea which directions. The Targum, Onkelos tells us, no, Abraham tells him where to go, north or south. North or south of where? Of Bet-El. North or south of Bet-El. Where does Lot end up going? I hate to confuse you with the geography here, but where does Lot end up going? Of course, Lot ends up going east. If you look at verse 11, and Lot chose for himself the entire plain of the Jordan, and Lot traveled from the east, and they parted from one another. Vayisa Lot mikedem. Here they translated from the east, mikedem. But we know, you look at the map, you will see that if Abraham is Bet-El, the Jordan is, the Sodom is south, but it's southeast. And therefore, there is an interesting a theory that goes as follows. When we think about Israel today, you think about Tel Aviv, because that's where most of the Jews live. There's 3 million Jews living around in the suburbs of Tel Aviv. But biblically speaking, that really was not the land of Canaan where most people settled. Where did the Jewish people live? The Jewish people lived on their mountains, on the mountains of Judea and the mountains of Samaria. And that's exactly where Abraham lives. Abraham is in Bet-El. Now, when you think about the mountain region, that mountainous region, the problem with that, there's an advantage and a disadvantage to living in that mountainous region. What is the advantage and the disadvantage? The advantage is that when it rains, it pours. In other words, when it rains, you don't have to work hard. You plow your field, but you don't have to water the field because it rains. The downside is that it doesn't always rain. Now, think about the land of Egypt. The land of Egypt is next to the Jordan, the land of Egypt is next to the river, the Nile. So the land of Egypt, there's no problem, there's no rain. So you have to actually water the ground with your own strength. In other words, either with canals, but you also need labor. You need labor to water the ground. But on the other hand, the rain supply, the water supply is consistent. So it takes more work, but it's consistent. Who makes this point? You don't need a later commentary to make this point. The person who makes this point very powerfully is Moses himself. When Moses, in the fifth book of the Torah, in Deuteronomy, when he wants to describe the land of Israel, that's the point that Moshe makes, and Moshe actually contrasts the land of Israel with the land of Egypt. So I'm just going to try to open up quickly so you see where I'm going with this. Okay, so we're looking at Moses. This is Moses in Deuteronomy, verse 10, chapter 11 in Deuteronomy, verse 10. For the land to which you are coming to possess it is not like the land of Egypt, out of which you came, where you sowed your seed and which you watered by foot like a vegetable garden. Okay, so the land of Egypt, you have to water by foot. It's very labor intensive. On the other hand, Moshe is, of course, only highlighting, Moshe is a good salesman. He's highlighting the advantage of Israel over Egypt. He's not highlighting the disadvantage. But the disadvantage of Egypt is that with Egypt, to water the ground is very labor intensive. He says you have to water it by your foot, which you watered by foot. But the land to which you pass to possess, in other words, the land of Israel, is a land of mountains and valleys and absorbs water from the rains of heaven. Literally, from the waters of the heaven, you will drink water. That's what Moshe says. That's the selling point. He says, Egypt, you have to work hard to get the water. Israel just falls from the skies. And again, Moshe is a good salesperson, so you can't blame him, but he's not really telling you the whole story. In other words, what's better? In some sense, the land of Egypt is better because the land of Egypt, you have consistent rain. Now, what Moshe is telling, so what this tells us about the land of Israel, that region is a region that you always have to look upward to heaven. In other words, it's not the easiest region to survive in the natural sense. I think that's true about today also, by the way. There are many advantages of living in Israel, but you certainly need to raise your eyes heavenward. It's not the most, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not the most naturally safe place. In other words, naturally secure place to be. Right? They say that Ben Gurion said that in Israel, we don't believe in miracles, we rely on them. Right? That's what it is. That's life in Israel. So in other words, you're relying on the rain, but to rely on the rain, you have to look heavenward. Look heavenward means you have to have a relationship with God. It's no surprise that Egypt, which does not have to look up for the rain, they constantly have the Nile. They have financial security as a society. They have nothing to worry about. So they don't have to worry about morality, about God, about morality. And therefore, it's no surprise that Egypt becomes the immoral place that it becomes. There's other issues too. If you need labor, you need slavery. So slavery develops in Egypt. But it all starts from the fact that you have a choice. Do you choose natural security? Not national, but natural. Do you choose natural security? Or do you choose I want to live in a place where my entire lifestyle is dependent on a relationship with God. I have to look heavenward for the water. So now, God tells Abraham, pick up and move, go to Israel. That's a very insecure thing to do. You're uprooting yourself. You're going to the unknown. But that's Abraham. That's the believer. Abraham goes to the unknown, comes to Israel, comes to a land where the economy itself is the unknown. Will it rain tomorrow? I don't know. Right? If you look, I'm sure that if they had today, you have all the research about the stock market, if it goes up or it goes down. I'm sure that in Israel then they had all the analysts predicting the rain. How many times does it rain in 50 years? When is the drought? When is the rain? When should you plant? In other words, there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, what happens? The first time he has a chance to run, Abraham tells him very clearly, I want you to go north or south. I want you to stay on the mountains with me. In other words, to stay on the place where there's no rain and you actually need to receive the rain from above. And Lot says, no, thank you. You gave me two choices where I should go, right or left, which the Targum says north or south. But you know where I'm going? I'm going east. You know where I'm going? I'm going off the mountains, going into the valley, going to the valley of Sodom, which the Torah itself says is like a Gan Hashem. It's like the garden of Hashem, like the land of Egypt, meaning it's just like Egypt. It's so fertile. But why is it so fertile? Because it's got all that water. Why does it have the water? Because it's next to the river. But what it doesn't have, it doesn't have that characteristic of the land of Israel, which is you're on the mountains, you're not bringing water up the mountain, you're relying on the rain. So Lot is saying, I don't want this lifestyle. I don't want a lifestyle where I have to trust God and therefore I have to have a relationship with God. I prefer the relationship of Egypt and Sodom, and that's where he chooses to go. So why are we saying this? I don't know, but I think it helps for the narrative. We need to know what's happening here now, how Abraham is going to interact with Sodom. Sodom becomes important, especially next week. So all this is all important, but on a very simple level, I think, in other words, the narrative, the fact that two people come from Haran, Lot and Abraham, and they're allegedly, on the surface, it looks like they're heeding the same call. They're both going to Israel. And yet, you see very quickly how they depart. And where they depart tells you where they differ. In other words, Lot at the end of the day was not willing to take the path that Abraham takes. And that's telling for us because that's where we live and that's the path that we take, either literally or figuratively. In other words, we understand that our survival is dependent on God, and we're happy with that. We're happy to look upward and say, well, we don't have all that financial security that the Nile offers. I don't mean just financial, but yet peace of mind that the Nile offers. But the problem with the Nile is you don't have to look heavenward to rain. And that means you don't have to think about my vulnerability. I'm not God. Like the Pharaoh representing the might of Egypt says, I'm God. I have everything I need. I'm independent, almost like the people building the Tower of Babel tried to do. But the point here is we're willing to have that relationship with God. We understand that we're dependent on something greater than ourselves. And that's part of how we understand ourselves, but it's also part of the topography and of Israel at that point. But even today, if you think about it, Israel has certain advantages to living in Israel. The lifestyle is great. The falafel is outstanding. The weather is nice. The beaches are good. But at some sense, to live there is a tremendous act of faith, right? It's not the most secure place to be, right? There's existential threats. But living in Israel is the statement of saying, I'm willing to be dependent on God. I'm willing to have that trust. And that's part of Abraham's journey. That's part of the Jewish journey. And that's even the part of the journey for the Jewish people who may not be living in Israel physically, but like the Chabad saying goes, we make Israel in the diaspora. In other words, we're living in an Israeli state of mind. So again, that's just a little bit, if you think about Lot, I think the fact that Lot is not able to stay with Abraham tells you because Abraham's journey requires faith. Abraham's journey requires trading some security for the dependence on God. And that's what it means to be Jewish. And some people don't want it, and that's fine. Lot doesn't want it, but that's what it means for us. And that's what it means to heed God's call and say, follow God. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I had a couple of questions. The first question is, Torah usually doesn't do that very often. In verse 10, it says, before Hashem destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. That's still coming. We have no idea what Sodom and Gomorrah is.
Yes.
Is it kind of a hint that it's very obvious if it's a hint that the land is problematic, right? But Torah
yeah. But I think also the Torah was written by who? Torah was written by Moses. And the people going into Israel then knew that region is desert. So if Moshe is writing, right, we know Moshe wrote the first book and a half of the giving of Torah and gave it to the Jewish people. So you're not going to understand why would Lot go to Sodom? It's the craziest thing. So the Torah has no choice but to tell you, make no mistake, he went to the fertile part of the land. He went to the part of Israel that's most like Egypt, right? So it's important. But you're right. The Torah almost never does that. It almost never goes back and to tell us. In other words, goes forward to tell us what's going on in the future. Correct. But in this case, it's critical.
It sounds like a hint. And also the other hint is right after Lot leaves, the Abraham receives the blessing of descendants. That's also.
But now it's reiterated. He gets it before also, but it's reiterated because now once we understand what Israel is, how do we understand what Israel is? Because we understand that Lot left. Lot says, I don't have anything to do with this. If you're going to force me to stay in Israel, I want to stay in the Little Egypt, right? What do they call it? In Egypt town. You have Chinatown, you have Little Italy. I want to be in China. I want to be in Egypt town if I have to be in Israel. In other words, I want to be in the region that's most like Egypt. And God, and Abraham says, I'm staying right where I am. So God says, now you got the point. Now you know what Israel is. Okay, I'm going to reiterate the commandment. You're going to get that, the promise that you're going to get the land of Israel for all eternity.
Thank you.
Okay, there's so much to talk about. The problem is that some years we get stuck. We always get stuck in the beginning and we never get further. So I want to jump ahead, talk about something that we don't always talk about. But it's a fascinating question to delve into. One of the reasons why it's so fascinating is because it's one of the great mysteries of the entire Torah. And there are a few great mysteries. I would say another great mystery, for example, is why was Moses not allowed into the land of Israel? Great mystery. By the way, how do you know if you have a question, this is what they teach you in yeshiva. How do you know if you have a question, you have an answer. How do you know if it's a good answer? So if you look at the literature and there's a question, a very powerful question, if you have one answer, it's probably a good answer. If the sages give 15 answers, then what does that tell you? None of the answers are really great. So everyone keeps trying. No one's satisfied. So the more answers you have to the same question, the more it tells you that the mystery is still there. So for example, the very famous mystery is what was the great sin of hitting the rock? Moses and Aaron hit the rock, and therefore they're not allowed into Israel. So what's the great sin? Why is it such a terrible sin? And okay, if they didn't listen to God, but why is it so terrible? And to the extent that is the cause of them getting this terrible punishment of not going into the land of Israel. So if you count how many answers the sages give to this question, I don't know, there's got to be tens of answers, right? So what does that tell you? Like they say in Yiddish they say the question is better than the answer. In other words, the mystery remains. We're not entirely clear. We have many answers, but we don't know. And there's a similar thing that happens in this week's parsha, but it's only introduced in this week's parsha, but it really carries through. It's one of the major stories of the Torah. What is the major stories of the Torah? That spans generations and is critical to our understanding of Judaism and everything. Everything is about the Exodus from Egypt. Hashem took us out of slavery in Egypt. Why were we slaves in Egypt to begin with? And it wasn't a mistake. In this week's parsha, Abraham tells God, how am I going to know that I'm going to indeed inherit the land? We'll get to that. What that means, it's another story. We'll get to that soon. And God says, we're going to do the covenant of the parts. The covenant of the parts is this ceremony. We're going to make a covenant. And here's the covenant. The covenant is, I'm going to promise you the land of Israel. So they do all kinds of strange things today that we consider them strange. They slice animals in half. They have all kinds of symbolism, which the commentaries address and discuss what the symbolism is. But the bottom line is, God tells Abraham, you're going to get this land, but, and here's the big but. The big but is your descendants will be slaves for 400 years in a foreign land, and then they will emerge with great wealth, and then they'll come back to this land. So it wasn't a mistake. This is part of the contract, right? When God signs a contract with Abraham, he says, I'm giving you the land. This is the covenant. It's in the covenant. There's going to be a slavery in Egypt. Question is, why? Now, the reason why it's such a great question is not a great question. The Torah does not give us anywhere any indication of what the reason for the slavery in Egypt. The entire 5 books of Moses and throughout really all of Judaism, really it's some way or another goes back to the Exodus and goes back to the slavery. So this is a very important question. And the question is, why, for what? Why were we slaves in Egypt? Why did this happen? Why was it destined all the way in the beginning that we become slaves? And here, like I said, it's a very good discussion. If you're looking for clarity, probably you should sign off now, because I'm not sure I have clarity. I have many different opinions, but I think I don't remember addressing this in the past at great length. I think it's interesting to delve into. We'll give the various options. And of course, we'll give the Hasidic option. And I'll give you I want to be completely transparent that I like the Hasidic one, and I'm going to try to push that one. But at least know that when I'm trying to, you should at least know that I'm trying to sell you something. I'm trying to sell you the Hasidic approach. But before we get to the Hasidic approach, we'll have to deal with what everybody else says. And before we do that, we have to look at what God said. So we'll have to open up the verses. Okay, the journey begins. Let's see if we can do this in 18 minutes. Here we go. For like we're baking matzah. When you bake matzah, from the beginning of this process to the end of the process, you have to be done within 18 minutes. So 18 minutes, and you go to the matzah bakery, the clock is ticking. Right before when the water touches the flour, they hit the clock, and you have 18 minutes to get it out of the oven. So let's see if we can bake something here and get it out of the oven in 18 minutes. Let's see what happens. Okay, so what's the story here? There's the story after these incidents, in other words, the battle with the 4 kings of the 5 kings, and Abraham is victorious in the battle. The word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision saying, fear not, Abraham, I am your shield. Your reward is exceedingly great. Okay, Abraham starts negotiating with God. What does it help me to have reward? I don't have any children, right? And Abraham said, oh, Lord God, what will you give me since I am going childless? And the steward of my household is Eliezer of Damascus. In other words, I don't have. And Abraham said, behold, you have given me no seed, and behold, no one of my household will inherit me. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this one will not inherit you, but the one who will spring from your inwards, he will inherit you. In other words, you'll have a descendant, a biological descendant. And he took him outside and he said, please look heavenward and count the stars if you're able to count them. And he said to him, so will be your seed. And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him as righteousness. Abraham believed in the Lord and the promise that he's going to have children, even though he was elderly at the time. Okay, we continue. By Yemeri love. And he said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldees to give you, or Kasdim, to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, oh Lord God, how will I know that I will inherit it? Not a perfect translation. With what will I know? And here's what they call the covenant between the parts. Gets a little gory here, but here we go. And he said, oh Lord God, how will I? Okay. And he said, verse 9, and he said to him, take for me 3 heifers and 3 goats and 3 rams and a turtle dove and a young bird. And he took for him all these, and he divided them in the middle, and he placed each part opposite its mate, but he did not divide the birds. And the birds of prey descended upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. And now the sun was ready to set, and a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. And behold, a great darkness was falling upon him. And here are the verses that we want to think about. And he said to Abraham, God tells Abraham, and he said to Abraham, you shall surely know. In Hebrew, it's Yado Atedan, knowing shall you know. When it's written twice, it means it's emphasis. Yado Atedan, you should know. That your seed will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. And also the nation that they will serve will I judge. In other words, God says he'll punish the people who oppress the Jews. Afterwards, they will go forth with great possessions. God tells Abraham, you don't have to worry because all this is going to happen after your lifetime. Verse 15, but you will come to your forefathers in peace. In other words, you will die and be buried before the slavery begins. You will be buried in a good old age. And the 4th generation will return here. In other words, 4 generations later, the Jewish people will return. 4 generations after the exile, that is, the Jewish people will return to Israel. And why? For the iniquity of the Amorites will not be complete until then. We'll deal with that later. Maybe we will, maybe next year. 17, now it came to pass that the sun had set, and it was dark, and behold, a smoking furnace and a firebrand which passed between the parts. In other words, there's a fire that goes between the parts that represents the covenant. And here we have verse 18. On that day, the Lord formed a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt until the great river, the Euphrates River, much greater than we have today. This is a nice region. From Egypt, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River, one day we'll get that too. The Canaanites, the Kenazzites, and the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Beautiful covenant between the parts. So here you have it. Here you have the covenant. God says, you should know that your descendants are going to be slaves 400 years. Afterward, they're going to return with great wealth. Now the question becomes, like I said, so the whole story revolves around it. From here, and at least of another book and a half, we're going to have the slavery, and we're going to have the Exodus, and then so much of what we do in our mitzvot is a memory of the Exodus, and it's all about the Exodus. But what about the slavery? Why? What's the reason for the slavery? So nobody knows the reason. I'm going to give you just a sample of some of the commentators. Some of the commentators, first, the Medrash has 3, and it's so many. I can't do comprehensive, but I'll try to do in and out, do short. Some people say simply, they say, look, it is a punishment for Abraham lacking faith. Where does Abraham lack faith? Right on this same page, right? God tells Abraham, right? Verse 7, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur, who brought you forth from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. In other words, God says, I'm going to give you this land. Abraham questions, and he says, oh Lord God, how will I know that I will inherit it? Give me a sign, prove to me, do something to prove to me that I'm going to get it. Some people say, the Medrash says, that seems to be a lack of trust. And therefore God says, oh, you want proof? I'll give you proof. I'll make this covenant between the parts. I promise you, but because you questioned, it's going to be delayed, and your descendants will be slaves in the land of Egypt. In other words, they're saying it's a lack of faith of Abraham. That is one interpretation. Another interpretation, which we alluded to, I think, on Sundays, Nachmanides. Nachmanides says that in this week's parasha, when God tells Abraham to go to Israel, he goes to Israel. In other words, God tells Abraham, go to the land that I will show you. And Abraham comes to Canaan, and God says, this is the land that I'm going to give it to you. And then there's the famine, and Abraham goes to Egypt. And we mentioned this on Sunday, that there's a great debate whether it was a sin that Abraham left Israel and went to Egypt. And Nachmanides says unequivocally, yes, it was a great sin. And he says the punishment is just like Abraham goes to Egypt, his descendants are going to be destined to go to Egypt. So the slavery is a sin for Abraham going to Egypt. And it's very interesting because there's a lot of parallels, just like Sarah was taken, and then Pharaoh was struck by God. And then they left, and Pharaoh gave Abraham and his wife a lot of possessions. That exact same pattern happens to their descendants. They go to Egypt, they're enslaved. Pharaoh is struck, the 10 plagues, and then the Jewish people leave Egypt with great wealth. So it fits like a puzzle according to Nachmanides. It fits, it's nice. And Nachmanides says it's a sin, it's a punishment for Abraham. So far we have two reasons, both punishment for Abraham, either because he lacked faith by questioning God and saying, how will I know I will inherit the land? Or because he left Egypt. Now, other people disagree with this entire train of thought. And I'm going to quote that Barbanel. Barbanel says it's impossible. It cannot be that it's a sin for Abraham. Why not? Because the verse itself right here says, right where God tells Abraham that your descendants are going to be slaves. What does the verse say in verse 15? But you will come to your forefathers in peace. You will be buried in good old age. This makes no sense. If it's all a punishment for Abraham, so how come Abraham himself doesn't experience the punishment? Okay, so that's sort of attacking that entire direction of looking for the reason for the Exodus, looking for the cause of the slavery in Abraham's sin. Abraham, according to Barbanel, and he has a nice proof, is absolved. It cannot be Abraham because Abraham, the Torah says, you're going to be buried in peace. In other words, it can't be his sin. So what are the other avenues? Barbanel himself leaves another avenue. He says, look, he says it's the sale of Joseph. The brothers sell Joseph as a slave, and Joseph's children are born in Egypt as a result of him being sold as a slave. So the punishment is that the brothers themselves have to go down to Egypt, and their children were born in the land of Egypt and ultimately in slavery. That's Barbanel. Barbanel's interpretation is also imperfect. Others say it's really a spiritual preparation for the receiving of the Torah. Either it humbles the Jewish people, or that they're going to experience the miracles. That's another train of thought. But again, other people disagree, because when it comes to the traveling through the desert, the miracles of the desert, the Torah says, Moshe says, that the miracles in the desert were here to educate you, to teach you that Hashem could protect you. There's no verse in the Torah, maybe it's obvious, but there's no verse in the Torah that says that the slavery in Egypt and the subsequent Exodus is here to teach you that God is all powerful. Maybe that's the message. I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm just saying that the weakness of saying that it's an education, the weakness of the reason that's saying that the slavery is for an educational purpose is that when it comes to the traveling through the desert, the Torah says it's for an educational purpose. When it comes to the slavery of Egypt, the Torah is silent. So maybe that's the right answer. I don't know. Like I said, there are many answers. I don't know the right answer. And there's other answers as well. So it's either the sin of Abraham, either the sin of the tribes selling Joseph as a slave. It could be a spiritual preparation for giving of the Torah. These are really the three general approaches, and each one could be subdivided into many more. So this is the big mystery. What is the Hasidic and Kabbalistic approach to this mystery? So the Hasidic and Kabbalistic approach to the mystery is that it's almost clear in the verse. It's almost clear in the verse. Why were we slaves in Egypt? Why do we descend in Egypt and go and have to suffer all that time away from Israel? It's right there on the page. What does the verse say? It's alluded to in verse 14. And also the nations that they will serve will I judge, and afterwards they will go forth with great possessions. The Jewish people going to Egypt, descending into Egypt, there's a reason for that. There's something we have to gain from being in Egypt. What do we have to gain? We will come out with great possessions. It's a good business investment. You go down to Egypt for 400 years. We'll be enslaved. Of those 400 years, we're enslaved for about 86. And we leave with a lot of money. Because you know the story. The story is not the best story. Don't tell it to your children. The story is that the Jewish people ask the Egyptians, could we please borrow your gold and silver? And they say, sure, on the way out. And they say, sure, and we never return it. But that's another story. So maybe we'll address that as well. The bottom line is, the verse seems to be saying the Hasidic interpretation is the verse says it's a great investment. You go down, you go to Egypt, and you're going to come out with great possessions. Now, what does that mean? If God has no other way to give the Jewish people possessions? So here you get to the Kabbalistic idea. And the Kabbalistic idea is that every single physical object has a spark of God. And it's incumbent upon the people, humanity, to what they call elevate the sparks. Elevate the sparks is to use the physical creations for the purpose they were created for, and that brings it back to holiness. And according to the Kabbalah, the Arizal spoke about this at great length, but the Hasidic movement continues this theme and says that wherever we go, any place we reach, and any possessions we interact with, it's because that's connected to our soul. Now, it's interesting that, I'll take your question in a second, Jill, but it's interesting that a lot of people heard the term bashert. I don't want to go into this, but you know that every person has a soulmate, and the Medrash says that before a person was born, the angel says, this person is going to marry that person. So everybody heard that. And bashert, what does it mean? What does it not mean? I don't want to get into that right now. What I do want to say is that same source says, not only does it say that this person you're going to marry this person, but it also says this field is going to belong to this person. This possessions, I think it says this cow, this animal is going to belong to that person. In other words, your soul has an intrinsic connection, not only to your soulmate, to the person you're going to marry, but also to the possessions that you're going to amass in this world. And the possessions that you have in this world are critical, first of all, for your purpose of creation as a whole, but also purpose of our creation as a people. So we have to go to Egypt to redeem the possessions from Egypt and elevate them to holiness. And that is why we went to the first exile, Egypt, and that's why we're in all exiles. Wherever we are, wherever we were scattered to, it's because we're supposed to interact with the physical world and get the great possessions. The great possessions is both. It's physical possessions, but it's also spiritual possessions, because the spiritual sparks are hidden within the physical possessions. And that's the Hasidic idea. I'm going to take Jill's question, and then I'm going to add a few interesting spices, because what I said till now you may have known, but we're going to add a few spices. Hopefully they're going to be new. Go ahead, Jill. Jill, I can't hear. If you're trying to speak, you're on mute. So if you want.
Yes. I think of Egypt as being the possessor. Their possession was a great culture.
Yes.
And what we did when we came away from there was to take that great culture and adapt it to a Judaic spiritual. We put a base under. We were no longer just a tribal culture, because we had been educated and elevated the Egyptian ideas to a new level.
So you're expanding it beyond what the Kabbalists are saying explicitly, but you're absolutely correct. Great possessions, in addition to the gold and silver, it's also the culture. And when we learn from that culture, we elevate those aspects of that culture that can be elevated. That is also part of the great possessions that we receive. Absolutely correct.
Rabbi, and another thing, it became the prototype for our wanderings and adapting the culture of any other country we ever went to.
Correct.
And not discarding it or naysaying it, but using it to elevate ourselves.
Correct. It's absolutely correct. I completely agree with you. To go back to what in the language of the Hasidic explanation is, they keep saying that some people, spiritual seekers, for example, some spiritual seekers try to separate from the physical world. It's our responsibility to interact with the great possessions. In other words, with the physical objects of the world that we are in contact with. And therefore, if you go later to where that story actually happens in reality, where God tells Moshe to tell the people, go and ask your neighbors for the gold and for the silver. There's a fascinating interpretation, the Hasidic interpretation, based on the verses. So there, the verse says, let me just find it for you in a second. I'm just going to read a few of the verses, just for the fun of it. Okay, here it is. So I jumped to Exodus chapter 11. The Lord said to Moses, okay, let's go to 12. Please speak into the ears of the people and let them borrow, each man from his friend and each woman from her friend, silver vessels and golden vessels. No, that's not the verse I'm looking for. That's not the verse I'm looking for. That's not the verse I'm looking for. Let's find the verse that I'm looking for. Three. Okay, I don't want to Exodus 3. Okay, I want to. This is at the burning bush. The first time God tells Moshe, go to Pharaoh and tell him to let the people go. Very quickly, God says right away, he says, I'm going to give the 10 plagues. And God keeps going back to the issue of you have to borrow the wealth of the Egyptians so you can leave with great wealth. Verse 22, each woman shall borrow from her neighbor and from the dweller in her house, silver and gold, objects and garments. And you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, and you shall empty out Egypt. The Hasidic interpretation reads this verse and says, who's the woman? The woman is the soul. The soul comes into the world, and the soul has neighbors. And the neighbor is the people who are, or the phenomenon that's a little more distant from you. And then you have people who dwell in your house. Who dwells in the soul's house? Who dwells in the same house as the soul? That's the body. In other words, the soul has the soul has temptation to say, I don't care about physicality. I don't care about the physical world. I don't care about amassing possessions. And God has to come and say, both in this verse and the verse that I showed you in Exodus 11, God says, please, you have to do me a favor. The whole purpose of the exit, of going into Egypt, the whole purpose of the pain and the suffering of the slavery is that ultimately we find the sparks, we bring back the sparks from in the physical objects and the wealth, but Jill is right, in the cultural wealth as well, that we derive from the land that we're in. And it's basically a statement of why are we traveling all over the world? Why have we been in exile for most of our history as a people? It's all for the great wealth that we get. And the great wealth is, again, spiritual, but also the spiritual sparks that are embedded within the physical world. And this gives us a completely different way of thinking about what we're doing here and thinking about the physical possessions. It's not so much that we need physical wealth in order to be able to serve God. That's true as well. But this is a little bit more radical. The purpose of the purpose of descending into this world, and this purpose of descending into the exile is so we unlock the sparks within the wealth. So every person has the obligation to achieve and amass as much wealth as possible to unlock those sparks. And that's a sort of a radical different way of viewing the physical reality, viewing wealth, but also viewing our purpose in creation. But I want to add one more spice. I know the matzah is already burnt. It's already past 18 minutes. But I have one more minute. I want to give one more little detail that I just discovered today for the first time that the Rebbe taught. I saw it in a secondary source. I want to find the original source. But you know what? I'll give it to you even before I find the original source. So we'll find it. That is, we have to go back to our Parsha. Okay, let's try to go back to our Parsha. Current Parsha text. Going back to the covenant between the parts. And he said to Abraham, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. And they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. So I never heard this I never saw this firsthand from the Rebbe's writings, but I saw it this morning in a secondary source that I'm going to go look for the original source. But what that source says, that the Rebbe said, why do you need these words? In a land that is not theirs. Why do you need to say in a land that is not theirs? If you erase these words, whoops. right? Assume we erase these words, and the land is not theirs. The verse would have been perfect. And he said to Abraham, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. Obviously, if you're strangers in a land, the land is not yours. The land is Leilahem, it's not theirs. So why does the verse have to say, you'll be strangers in a land that is not theirs? If it's mine, I'm not a stranger. So the Hasidic interpretation that Rebbe says is as follows, is very interesting. Before even God said anything, you should know that your descendants will be strangers in the land. Abraham was like, what? What are you talking about? What did we do wrong? Right? That's the first thing. What's the purpose of the slavery? What's the purpose of being a stranger? You just keep promising me the land, and then you tell me that we're going to be strangers. What's going on here in a foreign land? What's going on here? So what the Rebbe says is that what God says, right? Loi lahem, strangers in a land that is not theirs, loi lahem, not theirs, could also be read, it's not because of them. Don't search and say, what did we do wrong that we deserve the exile? Abraham and his descendants did not do anything that would justify the slavery. So what God is doing here with these words, not them, not that it means a land that's not theirs. Obviously, the land is not theirs. It's the reason for the exile is not theirs. Lo Elohem, it's not theirs. It's not on account of anything they did. Oh, you want to know why? Oh, there's great possessions coming. So that's just another way of reading this verse, and it sort of releases us from this great question of what did we do wrong to deserve the exile. From the Hasidic perspective, we did nothing wrong to deserve the exile. The exile is an opportunity to find the great wealth, the spiritual wealth, but truthfully, the spiritual wealth that is hidden, waiting to be unlocked within the physical wealth. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. A lot more to say about Abraham. We didn't even scratch the surface of two of the stories. Much more to say. So make sure to come back next year, same time, same place, in good health. And God will give us many, many more years so we can analyze the story of Abraham from all the angles. And if you missed a story that you didn't wanted to elaborate upon, no problem. Come back next year. We'll be back here.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
It's not related to what you were talking about. I was listening to another shiur, another lesson, and someone was saying that where it says Habetna Ashmaima shows that Avraham was actually brought up into heaven and was looking down at the stars.
That's what the Medrash says. The Medrash says it, I think, on a different verse. In other words, not so much Habetna Hashemayma, because Habetna Hashem means look upward, but I think it says say. It says go out. Let me double check if I could. Oh no, it's
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. I think
Thanks,
it's first.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Everybody have a wonderful day. The matzahs are burning. The class is over, so your matzah won't burn. Of course, you can stay extra if you'd like. If you look at verse 5.
Which chapter?
Chapter 15. You know what? Let me show it to you in Rashi, so you'll see it here in the English. You'll see it with Rashi. So it's chapter 15. Yeah. Oh no, Edras, I'm not going home now. No. Yeah. So this is from the covenant between the parts. Okay, let me share it. Covenant between the parts.
Why is it called the covenant between the parts, by the way?
Because they cut the animal, right here you see they cut the animal in verse 10, and then it says that right 17, now it came to pass that the sun had set and the dark and it was dark, and behold, this smoking furnace and a fire brand which passed between these parts. Okay. That's the way they made covenants in the ancient world. What they would do is to signify that we're one entity. They would take the animal, cut it in half, and the people would pass through the both sides of the animal, signifying that we're one.
Wow.
So that's what happens over here, right? You see by Vaterotam, verse 10, you see it. Okay, but in any case, in verse 5, it says, let me open the Rashis so we don't have to do it later. Verse 5 says, And he took him outside and he said, please look heavenward and count the stars. If you are able to count them, and he said to him, so will be your seed. Says Rashi, and he took him outside. According to the simple meaning, he took him out of his tent, outdoors to see the stars. But according to the midrashic interpretation, he said to him, go out of your astrology, for you have seen in the signs of the zodiac that you are not destined to have a son. Indeed, Abraham will have no son, but Abraham will have a son. Similarly, Sarai did not give birth, but Sarah will give birth. I will give you another name, and your destiny will change. So in other words, the Medrash says, go out. What does go out mean? It either means go outside, you're in the tent, go outside, or it means go out from limiting yourself based on the zodiac, based on the natural form, because naturally, Abraham can't have children, but you're no longer Abraham, you're Abraham. God will change who you are. And finally comes the third interpretation, which is what you said. Another explanation: he took him out of the terrestrial sphere and lifted him above the stars. This explains the expression of habata, looking down from above. Oh, so it is habet. It is habata. Very good. Yes. Now again, it's a medrash. This means literally or figuratively. It means you have to see yourself not trapped within the confines of the universe, but we are above the universe. We are above the limitations of nature.
So abata means looking down.
I didn't know that. I didn't remember this. I'll confess my ignorance. I was thinking that it's go out, but you're right. According to Rashi is saying that habata lehabit is usually used in the context of look from above to below.
Okay.
That's what Rashi says, according to Medrash, of course. Genesis Rabbah. Medrash Rabbah.
Thanks very much.
Okay, wonderful day, everybody. And lech lecha, keep traveling, and we'll reach the destination, the promised land.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.